Now let's dive into the story. Mark Davis trudged down the wet, rainy streets of a small college town in Texas, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He was exhausted, stressed, and feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. At 23, he was juggling his final year of law school, a part-time job, and the crushing debt his late father had left behind. Every day seemed like a battle, and today was no different. The constant worry over his future, over whether he would ever find peace, was beginning to wear him down. The sky above him was as gray as the cloud of doubt hanging over his head. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it from his pocket, saw the unknown number on the screen, and answered with a weary tone. "Mark Davis," he said, his voice flat. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks." A composed, authoritative voice responded on the other end. "I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." The words hit him like a punch in the gut. He frowned, confused. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "How do you know about?" "I know enough," she interrupted smoothly. "Let's meet at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before he could protest. Mark stared at his phone for a moment, his mind racing. Who was this woman? How did she know about his struggles? And why did she want to meet him? He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut, but he had little choice. He needed answers. Maybe this meeting was the opportunity he was waiting for. Mark made his way to the bistro, the rain falling harder as he arrived. He stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the place contrast sharply with the cold, wet world outside. The cozy ambience, with its low lighting and the scent of freshly brewed coffee, was a world away from the harsh reality he had been living. He found Eleanor Brooks sitting at a corner table, looking every bit the image of wealth and power. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, and she wore a tailored suit that radiated sophistication. "Mark," she greeted him with a nod, her voice calm, yet commanding. "Please sit." He hesitated for a moment, then sat across from her, feeling completely out of place. This woman seemed like she belonged to another world, a world far removed from his own. "Mrs. Brooks, I don't understand. What exactly is this about?" Mark asked, trying to make sense of the situation. Eleanor didn't waste any time. She set down her cup of tea and looked him straight in the eye. "Mark, I know about the debts your father left behind. I know you're struggling to make ends meet, trying to keep your life from falling apart. And I have a solution for you." Her words were measured, as if she were offering him a lifeline. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. "A solution?" Mark echoed, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering just enough for it to feel intimate. "I propose a marriage. Not for love, but for security. You marry me, and I will pay off all your debts, secure your future, and ensure that you never have to worry about money again." She paused, letting the weight of her offer sink in. Mark sat there, stunned. Marriage? To a woman he barely knew? It sounded insane. "I know it sounds crazy," she continued, her tone never faltering. "But think about it. You're young, unattached, and in desperate need of help. This is a business arrangement. No emotions, no strings, just a contract. You do this, and everything you've been struggling with will disappear." Mark was speechless. The offer was absurd, yet somehow, it felt like the only choice left. He thought about the bills piling up, the threat of losing everything, and the weight of his responsibilities. This was his chance to escape the crushing pressure he was under. He glanced at her, searching for any sign that she was joking. But there was nothing. She was serious. "You don't need to love me, Mark," Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. "You just need to accept the offer. What's the worst that could happen?" She gave him a moment to process the decision, her gaze steady. Mark swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of the situation settling on his chest. Was he really considering this? Marrying a stranger for the sake of his financial survival? But as he looked at Eleanor, calm, collected, and in control, he realized that this might be the only way out. The weight of his debts, his fears about the future, they all seemed to vanish for a moment. He felt a strange sense of hope flicker inside him. I need some time to think about it," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course. Take your time. But don't take too long, Mark. This offer won't last forever." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. Mark Davis trudged down the wet, rainy streets of a small college town in Texas, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He was exhausted, stressed, and feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. At 23, he was juggling his final year of law school, a part-time job, and the crushing debt his late father had left behind. Every day seemed like a battle, and today was no different. The constant worry over his future, over whether he would ever find peace, was beginning to wear him down. The sky above him was as gray as the cloud of doubt hanging over his head. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it from his pocket, saw the unknown number on the screen, and answered with a weary tone. "Mark Davis," he said, his voice flat. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks." A composed, authoritative voice responded on the other end. "I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." The words hit him like a punch in the gut. He frowned, confused. "I'm sorry, who are you? How do you know about I?" "Know enough?" She interrupted smoothly. "Let's meet at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before he could protest. Mark stared at his phone for a moment, his mind racing. Who was this woman? How did she know about his struggles? And why did she want to meet him? He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut, but he had little choice. He needed answers. Maybe this meeting was the opportunity he was waiting for. Mark made his way to the bistro, the rain falling harder as he arrived. He stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the place contrast sharply with the cold, wet world outside. The cozy ambience, with its low lighting and the scent of freshly brewed coffee, was a world away from the harsh reality he had been living. He found Eleanor Brooks sitting at a corner table, looking every bit the image of wealth and power. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, and she wore a tailored suit that radiated sophistication. "Mark," she greeted him with a nod, her voice calm, yet commanding. "Please sit." He hesitated for a moment, then sat across from her, feeling completely out of place. This woman seemed like she belonged to another world, a world far removed from his own. "Mrs. Brooks, I don't understand. What exactly is this about?" Mark asked, trying to make sense of the situation. Eleanor didn't waste any time. She set down her cup of tea and looked him straight in the eye. "Mark, I know about the debts your father left behind. I know you're struggling to make ends meet, trying to keep your life from falling apart. And I have a solution for you." Her words were measured, as if she were offering him a lifeline. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. "A solution?" Mark echoed, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering just enough for it to feel intimate. "I propose a marriage. Not for love, but for security. You marry me, and I will pay off all your debts, secure your future, and ensure that you never have to worry about money again." She paused, letting the weight of her offer sink in. Mark sat there, stunned. Marriage? To a woman he barely knew? It sounded insane. "I know it. Sounds crazy," she continued, her tone never faltering. "But think about it. You're young, unattached, and in desperate need of help. This is a business arrangement. No emotions. No strings. Just a contract. You do this, and everything you've been struggling with will disappear." Mark was speechless. The offer was absurd, yet somehow, it felt like the only choice left. He thought about the bills piling up, the threat of losing everything, and the weight of his responsibilities. This was his chance to escape the crushing pressure he was under. He glanced at her, searching for any sign that she was joking. But there was nothing. She was serious. "You don't need to love me, Mark," Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. "You just need to accept the offer. What's the worst that could happen?" She gave him a moment to process the decision, her gaze steady. Mark swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of the situation settling on his chest. Was he really considering this? Marrying a stranger for the sake of his financial survival? But as he looked at Eleanor, calm, collected, and in control, he realized that this might be the only way out. The weight of his debts, his fears about the future, they all seemed to vanish for a moment. He felt a strange sense of hope flicker inside him. I need some time to think about it," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. Of course. Take your time. But don't take too long, Mark. This offer won't last forever. The next day, Mark found himself walking through the rain again, but this time, his mind was a whirlwind. The meeting with Eleanor Brooks had left him unsettled. He couldn't stop thinking about the offer. Marriage. To a woman he barely knew. For the sake of his debts. Was this really the solution to all his problems? Or was it just another desperate escape? He barely had time to process the situation before his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Eleanor. Mark, I trust you've had time to think it over. I'll be at Brooks Bistro tonight at 7 p.m. If you've made your decision, I'll be waiting for you. Mark stared at the message for a long time, his thumb hovering over the screen. The weight of his debts pressed heavily on him. But the thought of marrying a stranger, even under such circumstances, felt like a leap he wasn't sure he was ready to take. He pushed the phone back into his pocket and continued his walk. The rain was lighter now, but the sky still felt heavy with the uncertainty that hung over him. He had to admit to himself, though, that the offer was tempting. Eleanor wasn't just offering a way out of his financial struggles. She was offering him a chance to escape the suffocating grip of his past. No more worrying about how he would pay the bills, no more feeling like a failure. But was it worth it? Was the price of his independence worth the loss of his freedom? By the time Mark reached the bistro, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the wet streets. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was to come next. He pushed open the door to the bistro and immediately saw Eleanor sitting at the same table from the night before. She looked even more imposing in the dim light, her silver hair shining under the warm glow of the chandelier above. She was calm, collected, as if she was used to making decisions like this every day. Mark approached the table, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor looked up as he neared and offered a small, polite smile. I'm glad you came, Mark, she said, her voice as smooth as ever. Please sit. She gestured to the chair across from her. Mark sat down, feeling the weight of the decision that loomed over him. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and Mark struggled to find the right thing to say. I've thought about it, Mark said finally, his voice steady but unsure. And I'm willing to accept your offer. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Mark could see the faintest glimmer of approval in her eyes. She nodded slowly, as if she had already known his answer before he spoke. Good, she replied. I expected nothing less. She paused for a moment before continuing. But I need you to understand, Mark, this isn't going to be a fairy tale. We're not doing this because we have feelings for each other. This is strictly a business arrangement. No emotions, no complications. You do your part, and I'll make sure your future is secured. Mark nodded. He understood. He had no illusions about what this marriage would be. But as he looked at Eleanor, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her than just the cold, calculated businesswoman sitting in front of him. Despite her stern demeanor, there was something in the way she spoke, something in the way she carried herself that made him think she might be hiding her own fears, her own loneliness. I understand, Mark said, his voice more confident now, and I'll do my part. I'll sign whatever contracts you need me to. I just need to make sure that everything is in place, that there's no turning back. Eleanor smiled slightly, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Of course, she said. Everything will be taken care of. All the legalities will be handled, and we'll make this as smooth as possible. You'll have your debt paid off, and you'll be free to pursue whatever you want, with no obligations. Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. For the first time in a long while, he felt like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. He had a way out of the mess his life had become. But as he sat there, listening to Eleanor speak, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Was this really the answer? Could a simple contract really provide the kind of security he was looking for? Or would this deal come at a cost he hadn't yet realized? But before he could voice his concerns, Eleanor continued. I'll have everything ready for you by tomorrow, she said. Once we sign the papers, you'll officially be a part of the family. And from that point on, your future will be secure. Mark nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. He couldn't help but feel like he was stepping into a world that was far beyond his understanding. A world of wealth, power, and expectations. But it was a world that promised to take him away from his struggles, a world that seemed to offer him a chance at a fresh start. As they finished their coffee, Eleanor stood up, signaling the end of their meeting. "I'll send you the documents," she said, offering her hand. Mark shook it, and for the first time since they met, he felt a strange sense of finality. This was happening. His life was about to change forever. "I'll be in touch soon," Eleanor said, her voice softer now. "And remember, Mark, this is a business arrangement. But I think we both know that sometimes business can lead to unexpected outcomes." She gave him a pointed look, and Mark wasn't sure if it was a warning or a promise. He left the bistro, the weight of his decision still heavy on his shoulders. But one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. The following day, Mark found himself in the sleek, modern office building of Eleanor Brooks. The walls were made of glass, offering a stunning view of the city skyline. He had never been in a place like this before, and the overwhelming luxury made him feel like an intruder. The receptionist led him to a spacious conference room, where Eleanor was already waiting. She stood by the window, looking out at the city with a quiet intensity, her silver hair gleaming under the sunlight. She turned when she heard him enter, offering a polite, businesslike smile. "Mark," she said, her voice smooth as ever. "I'm glad you made it." She gestured for him to sit across from her, and he complied, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. This wasn't just a business deal anymore. It felt like something much bigger. Eleanor had already made the arrangements for their marriage contract, and soon it would be official. He would sign his name on the dotted line, and his life would be forever changed. "Thank you for meeting me here," Mark said, trying to mask the anxiety he was feeling. "I know everything is moving fast, but I still don't really understand what I'm getting into." He felt exposed, sitting across from Eleanor, who seemed to have everything under control. She didn't look like someone who had ever been uncertain, someone who had ever needed a second chance. Eleanor didn't seem to mind his apprehension. She simply smiled and placed a set of papers in front of him on the table, the marriage contract clearly laid out. "It's simple," she said. "We both have our roles to play. You will fulfill your part, and in return, everything you've been worrying about will be taken care of. Your debts will be paid off, and you'll have the freedom you've been longing for." Her eyes held a steady gaze, and Mark couldn't help but feel like she was reading him, understanding his hesitation without a word being said. He looked down at the papers, his mind racing. The numbers, the clauses, everything seemed too simple. Was this really what he wanted? A contract instead of love, security instead of happiness? But the thought of losing everything he had worked for, his education, his future, was too much to bear. He needed this. His family depended on it. The stakes were high, and there was no turning back now. "I know this isn't easy, Mark," Eleanor continued, as though she could sense the war within him. "But think of it this way. This is a transaction. Nothing more, nothing less. And when it's over, you will have the chance to truly live your life without fear. I'm offering you a clean slate. A fresh start. You can't buy that kind of freedom." Mark swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He had spent so many sleepless nights worrying about the future, and now, Eleanor was offering him a way out. But as he glanced at the papers again, his mind flashed back to his earlier thoughts. Was this what he really wanted? Could a simple agreement really provide the kind of peace he was searching for? Or would this just be another empty promise? He took a deep breath and pushed the thoughts aside. He wasn't going to let fear control him anymore. He had no choice but to accept. He signed the papers, each stroke of the pen feeling like a nail being driven into his future. Eleanor watched him, her expression unreadable. Once he finished, she carefully gathered the papers and slid them into a folder. "Thank you, Mark," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "You've made a wise decision." He stood up, still processing what had just happened. This was it. His life was no longer his own, at least not in the way he had imagined. But Eleanor wasn't done yet. She handed him a business card, the gold letters embossed with the Brooks Enterprises logo. "Call me if you need anything," she said. "And remember, this is just the beginning." She gave him a smile that was both warm and distant, as if she had seen this all before. Mark left the office, feeling like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but also like he had just entered a new world. The kind of world that was far removed from everything he had known. As he stepped outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun was peeking through the clouds, casting a soft light over the city. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he could breathe. But he also knew that everything was about to change. He had made his choice. There was no going back. As he walked down the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Was this the right path for him? Was he really ready to give up everything for the promise of security? Only time would tell. But for now, he would play his part. He had no other option. The contract had been signed. The future was in motion. Days passed since Mark signed the marriage contract, and life seemed to fall into a strange routine. He moved into the luxurious penthouse that Eleanor had arranged for him, a space far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The high-rise apartment offered a breathtaking view of the city below, and he found himself standing by the window more often than he liked, staring out at the skyline, trying to make sense of everything. He had everything now: money, security, and a life that no longer had to be lived in fear of debt, but it felt empty. Eleanor remained distant, businesslike, her presence in his life only adding to the growing tension between them. Despite the quiet arrangement, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Every time he saw Eleanor, she was focused, efficient, as if she had it all together. But there were moments when he caught a glimpse of something else, something softer behind her eyes. A vulnerability that she didn't seem to want anyone to see. It made him wonder if she was just as trapped as he was, bound by her own choices and responsibilities. One evening, after another long day of meetings and legal paperwork, Mark found himself sitting alone at the kitchen table, the silence of the apartment pressing in on him. He glanced down at the stack of documents that Eleanor had left for him to sign, but his mind wasn't on the papers. He was thinking about her, the woman he had married, the woman who had offered him a way out, but never once asked for anything in return. Or had she? Was it possible that she had expectations that he hadn't fully understood? He reached for his phone and sent her a quick message. "Eleanor, can we talk?" He stared at the screen for a few moments, then put the phone down, unsure of what he wanted to say. The idea of confronting her felt intimidating, but the weight of their arrangement was starting to take its toll. He wasn't sure how much longer he could play the role of her husband without knowing where he truly stood in all of this. To his surprise, her reply came almost instantly. "Of course. I'll be home in 30 minutes. We can talk then." Mark took a deep breath, standing up from the table. He wasn't sure what this conversation would lead to, but he knew it had to happen. He needed answers. He needed to understand why Eleanor had chosen him, why she had offered him this strange, no-strings-attached arrangement. And somewhere, deep down, he needed to know if she saw him as anything more than just a financial asset. When Eleanor arrived, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She walked into the living room, looking every bit the businesswoman she had always been, her expression unreadable. "What's on your mind, Mark?" she asked, her tone neutral. She stood a few feet away from him, arms crossed, waiting for him to speak. He hesitated, then finally asked, "Why me? Why did you offer me this deal? You could have chosen anyone." For a moment, Eleanor didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her eyes calculating, as if she were deciding whether or not to tell him the truth. Finally, she sighed, uncrossed her arms, and took a step closer. "You're right. I could have chosen anyone," she said quietly. "But I didn't want anyone. I wanted someone who had nothing left to lose, someone who could appreciate what I was offering. I needed a partner in this, someone who could fulfill the legal and business aspects of our marriage, yes, but also someone who wasn't bound by the expectations that come with being in a world of wealth and privilege. You don't belong in my world, Mark. And in some ways, I think that's what makes you perfect for this arrangement." Her words hung in the air, and Mark felt a pang of discomfort. He didn't know if he was supposed to be flattered or insulted. Eleanor was offering him a life of luxury, but it seemed as though she was also reminding him of his place in this world. Someone who didn't belong, someone who was just filling a role. "So, this is just business for you?" he asked, trying to hide the sting in his voice. She nodded. "Yes, Mark. It's business. And I know that might sound cold, but it's the reality of my life. I've spent so many years building everything I have. I don't have time for love, for emotions. That's why I made this deal with you. We both get something out of it." Mark's thoughts raced as he processed her words. He had always known that Eleanor wasn't in this for love, but hearing her say it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, made him feel small. Was he just a pawn in her world? Was that all he was ever going to be? "And what about me, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "What do I get out of this? What do you expect from me?" For the first time in their conversation, Eleanor seemed to soften. Her gaze dropped for a moment, and she let out a quiet sigh. I expect nothing from you, Mark, she said, almost gently. I'm not asking for anything that isn't already part of the agreement. But, she hesitated, then looked up at him with a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. I think, maybe there's more to this than I'm willing to admit. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he met her gaze. For a brief moment, it felt like the walls between them were crumbling, like she was showing him a side of herself that no one had ever seen before. What do you mean? He asked, unable to hide the curiosity in his voice. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She simply walked over to the window and stood there, looking out at the city. The light from the street lamps below bathed her face in a soft glow, and for the first time, Mark saw her not as a businesswoman, but as a woman who had perhaps been hiding behind her carefully crafted facade for far too long. I think we both got more than we bargained for, Mark, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark stood there, unsure of how to respond. Eleanor's words hung in the air between them, leaving him with more questions than answers. Was this just the beginning of something new? Or was it already too late for them to change what had been set in motion? The days after their conversation felt heavier than before. Mark couldn't stop thinking about what Eleanor had said. There was a quiet shift between them, a subtle change that neither of them acknowledged outright, but both felt. Their lives had become intertwined in ways neither expected, bound by a contract that was meant to be purely transactional. But as they shared more quiet moments, something deeper started to emerge, something that neither could quite define. Eleanor remained distant, as if keeping a wall up, yet Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than the businesswoman she portrayed. She wasn't as cold and calculated as she wanted him to believe. One evening, after another long day of signing papers and attending meetings, Mark found himself at a gala. He had been invited as Eleanor's +1, though they both knew it was just a part of the arrangement. He had been briefed on how to act, what to say, and the image he needed to project. But as he stood beside her, watching the crowd mingle, he realized just how out of place he felt. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease, gliding through the room with grace, commanding attention without saying a word. She was the center of everything, the figure everyone gravitated toward. Mark couldn't help but admire her, despite the fact that she was still a mystery to him. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself drifting further from the center of the room, standing by a window, looking out at the city below. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but all he could think about was Eleanor's words. Maybe there's more to this than I'm willing to admit. What did that even mean? He had thought the arrangement was clear. He would fulfill his part, and she would take care of him, financially and otherwise. But what if there was something more? What if she wasn't just offering him a life of security, but something he wasn't prepared to accept? His thoughts were interrupted by a voice beside him. Eleanor had approached, standing next to him, her presence commanding as always. She looked out at the city, her gaze distant. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, her voice softer than usual. There was a subtle change in her tone, something Mark couldn't place, but it made him uneasy. "I'm just trying to figure things out," Mark replied, not taking his eyes off the city. "I don't really belong here. This life is nothing like I imagined." Eleanor remained silent for a moment, then finally spoke. "I never asked you to imagine it, Mark. I asked you to live it. To make it work for you, for us." Her voice was calm, but there was something in it that made Mark feel like he was being tested. He turned to look at her, noticing the way her expression had softened, almost imperceptibly. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm really living or if I'm just pretending. This whole thing, it feels like a game. A game I don't know how to play." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low. "It's not a game, Mark. It's real. You've seen the contracts. You know what's expected. You don't need to play any role except the one you're in. And that's enough." She paused before adding, "But I understand. This isn't easy. It wasn't easy for me, either." Mark was taken aback. Eleanor, the woman who always seemed in control, the woman who had built an empire, was telling him that she, too, struggled. The realization hit him harder than he expected. "You don't have to pretend with me," Eleanor continued, her voice steady but tinged with something Mark couldn't quite place. "I know what this arrangement looks like on the outside. I know it's not what either of us imagined. But I also know that sometimes the things that look the hardest are the ones that teach us the most. Maybe that's what we both need right now, a lesson. Mark felt a shift in the air, a weight that had been hanging between them beginning to ease. For the first time, Eleanor seemed vulnerable. Not the strong, impervious figure she projected, but someone who, like him, had their own fears and uncertainties. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the gala faded into the background as they stood there together, looking out at the city. Mark felt the tension that had been building between them dissipate, replaced by something else, something deeper, but still uncertain. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. Maybe we should stop pretending, Mark. Maybe it's time we figured out what this really is. Mark turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever came next. But somehow, in that moment, he knew that whatever it was, it would change everything. They stood there, two people who had entered into an arrangement for reasons neither of them fully understood. But now, it seemed, they were both beginning to realize that the deal they had struck might be far more complicated than they had ever imagined. The days that followed were marked by a strange quietness between Mark and Eleanor. They had reached a point where neither knew exactly what they were anymore. Were they still strangers, bound by a contract, or something else? Their interactions were cordial, polite, but distant. Mark continued to live in the penthouse, going through the motions of his new life, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was beginning to stir between him and Eleanor. It was in the way she looked at him when they were alone, the subtle warmth in her voice when they spoke, but it was still all unspoken. Neither of them had addressed what had shifted, and neither was willing to make the first move. Eleanor kept herself busy with meetings and charity events, while Mark tried to immerse himself in the new world he was supposed to belong to. But it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness he sometimes felt when he woke up in the huge, lonely apartment. One evening, after another high-profile gala that he had attended as Eleanor's husband, Mark returned to the penthouse, his mind foggy from the constant whirlwind of social events. He set down his coat, kicked off his shoes, and slumped into a chair by the window. The city lights shimmered below, but the glow didn't provide the comfort it once did. He glanced over at the empty space across from him. It was late, and Eleanor hadn't returned yet, as usual. He had gotten used to the solitude, but something about tonight felt different. He didn't want to be alone. He hadn't wanted to be alone for a long time. Just as he was about to reach for a drink, he heard the sound of the elevator, followed by the soft click of the door opening. Eleanor stepped inside, her posture stiff, but her eyes tired. She was still wearing the same formal attire from the gala, but her makeup had faded slightly, and her hair was loose, falling gently around her shoulders. "I didn't expect you to be up," she said softly, her voice unusually quiet. Mark stood up as she walked in, feeling a shift in the air between them. There was something unspoken there, something that neither of them had been willing to address, but tonight, it felt different. Eleanor looked over at him, her eyes lingering on his face for a moment too long. "I couldn't sleep," Mark admitted, his voice low. "I guess. I'm still trying to figure this all out." Eleanor hesitated before she spoke, her gaze softening. She stepped further into the room, pulling off her heels and setting them neatly by the door. There was a vulnerability in her movement that Mark hadn't seen before. She wasn't the confident, poised Eleanor he had gotten used to. She seemed human in a way that made him feel both closer and more distant at the same time. "It's a lot, I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never imagined it would be this hard. I thought I could keep things under control." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "But sometimes, I wonder if I'm just fooling myself." Mark felt a sudden rush of understanding. He had seen the masks people wore at the gala, the facades everyone put up to fit in with the world of wealth and privilege. But standing here, in the quiet of the penthouse, he saw something different in Eleanor's eyes. She wasn't just a powerful businesswoman anymore. She was a woman who had made difficult choices, who had to navigate a world that seemed impossible to truly belong to. He stepped closer, his voice gentle. "You don't have to pretend with me, Eleanor. Not anymore." She looked at him, her expression a mixture of relief and something else, something that Mark couldn't quite identify. Eleanor took a step closer, her hand brushing against his as she reached for the nearby couch, sitting down. She didn't say anything at first, just looked out at the city, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Maybe I've spent too much time pretending." Eleanor said quietly, her eyes never leaving the view. I built this life, but I never really thought about what I was building it for. I never thought about what it would cost me. She turned toward Mark then, her gaze steady. You're not the only one who's lost something in this arrangement. Mark didn't know how to respond. He had always seen Eleanor as the one in control, the one who had all the answers. But now, standing here with her, he realized how much she was hiding, how much they were both hiding from each other. He sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They sat in silence, the soft hum of the city below filling the space between them. Mark could feel the tension melting away, replaced by something else. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something that neither of them had expected. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence, her voice soft but certain. I never asked you to love me, Mark. But maybe we don't have to be alone in this. She turned toward him, her hand reaching for his. Maybe we can try to figure this out together. Not as a contract, but as two people who are just trying to make sense of the world they've created. Mark looked down at their hands, then back up at her. The walls between them were coming down, piece by piece. They weren't just partners in a contract anymore. They were something else, something undefined, but real. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was hope. Hope for something beyond the life they had built around obligations. I think I can live with that, Mark said quietly, his voice filled with a sincerity he hadn't known he was capable of. Eleanor smiled softly, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long while. Then let's see where this takes us. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Mark and Eleanor. The initial tension between them slowly faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. They didn't talk about their arrangement much anymore. It wasn't necessary. They had both settled into a rhythm, finding comfort in their shared space, their occasional conversations, and the unspoken bond that was growing between them. Mark still lived in the penthouse, but it no longer felt like a gilded cage. It felt like home. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. Eleanor was still as driven and focused as ever, but there were moments when Mark saw the vulnerability she had once hidden so well. Moments when she let her guard down, even if only for a second. One night, after another long day, they found themselves sitting together in the living room. It was late, the only light coming from the soft glow of the city lights outside. The silence between them was comfortable now, not awkward like it had been at the beginning. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. They were becoming something more, though neither of them was quite ready to admit it. Do you ever think about the future? Mark asked, his voice quiet as he glanced at Eleanor. She looked up from the book she had been reading, her eyes thoughtful. All the time, she replied. But I try not to think too far ahead. It's easier that way. Her gaze drifted out to the city skyline, and for a moment, she seemed lost in thought. Mark shifted in his seat, watching her closely. Easier to control things, I suppose. She nodded. Exactly. It's safer when you don't let yourself get too attached to anything. Or anyone. Her words stung more than Mark expected, but he couldn't blame her. He understood. They had both come into this relationship with their own walls, their own fears. They had both been running from something, or maybe towards something, but neither of them had fully let go of their pasts. But I'm not asking you to control everything, Mark said softly. We're both in this, Eleanor. Together. And I think that means we don't have to hide anymore. We don't have to pretend that we're just partners in a deal. Eleanor turned to look at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, she did something Mark hadn't expected. She smiled. It wasn't a business smile, the kind she gave in public. It was real, soft, genuine. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not pretending anymore. And I think, maybe you're right. Maybe we don't have to keep pretending that this is just a business arrangement. Maybe there's more to it than that. Mark's heart raced at her words, and for the first time since they had met, he realized that maybe he had been right, too. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. They were something more, something real. And it wasn't just the security that Eleanor had promised him, but the way they had started to rely on each other. They were no longer living separate lives in the same space. But before Mark could respond, there was a knock at the door, interrupting their moment. Eleanor stood up, smoothing out her dress as she walked toward the door. Mark couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment, but he quickly brushed it aside. Life wasn't a fairy tale. They still had to face the world, with all of its interruptions and distractions. Eleanor opened the door to reveal a courier holding a large envelope. She signed for it, then turned back to Mark with a small frown. "It's from my lawyer," she said, walking back to the couch and sitting down. She opened the envelope and glanced over the papers inside. Mark could see the weight of the documents in her hands, the tension in her shoulders as she read through them. "Is everything okay?" Mark asked, noticing her change in demeanor. She looked up at him, her eyes hardening for a moment before she set the papers down on the coffee table. "It's nothing. Just some legal stuff that needs to be addressed. Nothing for you to worry about," she said, her tone professional, but there was an edge to her voice that Mark didn't like. He could tell something was bothering her, but she wasn't willing to share it. Mark nodded, not wanting to push her further. But as he sat there in the quiet of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. They had come so far, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. And whatever lay ahead, Mark knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to walk it alone. The following week, Mark stood by the window of the penthouse once again, watching the city below. He had been trying to make sense of everything, his life, his arrangement with Eleanor, and what they had become over the past few months. The days were starting to blur together, but there was a subtle shift in the air between them. Something unspoken, but there. Eleanor had been more distant than usual since the meeting with her lawyer. She had kept to herself, focusing on work, while Mark found himself lost in thoughts he hadn't dared voice out loud. They had stopped pretending, but neither of them was sure what to do with that newfound honesty. As he stood there, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Eleanor. "We need to talk." The words sent a jolt through him, a mix of apprehension and curiosity. He hadn't heard from her much that day. He had tried to stay out of her way, respecting her space, but now, with those 3 words, everything felt different. He quickly typed a reply. "I'll be here." Mark put the phone down, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't help but wonder what she wanted to talk about. Was it more of the legal stuff from the lawyer's letter? Or was it something else entirely? Something more personal? He wasn't sure, but as he waited, the uncertainty gnawed at him. When Eleanor finally came home that evening, she looked the same as always, composed and elegant, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Mark that whatever they were about to discuss, it wasn't just business. She walked into the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and stopped just a few feet from him. The space between them felt bigger than it was, charged with an invisible tension. "We need to talk about what comes next," she said, her voice low, almost reluctant. Mark nodded, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers briefly touching the back of the chair beside her, but then she looked up at him, her gaze steady. "I've been thinking a lot about our arrangement," she said, the words carefully chosen. "About what it really means. We've been living together, yes, but it's more than that now. We've started to build something here. A connection. And it's not something I can just ignore anymore." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Was this the conversation he had been waiting for? The one where they finally talked about what had been growing between them. But then, a part of him also felt afraid. What if Eleanor still saw it as just business? What if the connection she was talking about was something entirely different from what he had hoped for? "I know this wasn't supposed to be a love story," Eleanor continued, "but I don't want to keep pretending. We've both changed. I've changed." She paused, as if unsure whether to say what she was feeling. But then, as if the weight of her words couldn't be held back any longer, she spoke again, softer this time. "Mark, I think I might be falling for you." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark could barely breathe. He had heard those words, but they didn't seem real. Falling for him? Eleanor? The woman who had so carefully kept her distance, who had treated everything as a transaction. Was it possible that this wasn't just a contract anymore? Was there more between them than he had dared to believe? He swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. All the doubts, all the fears, came flooding back. He had wanted this, wanted to believe that they could be something real, but hearing it from her made it feel unreal. "Eleanor," he began, his voice shaky, "I don't know what to say. I never expected any of this to happen. I didn't expect to feel the way I do now." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "But I'm not sure what this means for us. For me. I thought I was just here to help you, to get my life back on track. But now, everything feels so complicated." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes filled with sincerity. "I know, Mark," she said softly. I'm not asking for answers right now. I just wanted to be honest with you. We've spent so much time pretending, and I can't do that anymore. Whatever happens next, I need you to know that this is real for me." Mark looked at her, his heart beating faster. He didn't know where this would go, what it would mean for them, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was alone in this. Eleanor had taken the first step, and now it was his turn. He reached out, his hand brushing hers. "I don't know what's next, either," Mark said, his voice low but steady, "but I'm willing to find out. With you." For the first time in a long while, Eleanor smiled, a smile that reached her eyes. It wasn't just business anymore. It was something more. And for both of them, it felt like the beginning of something new. Weeks passed, and the dynamic between Mark and Eleanor continued to evolve in ways neither of them had anticipated. The foundation of their arrangement was still there, but now it was built on something deeper, something that neither could ignore. They had been honest with each other, for the first time, about what they had started to feel. The walls that had once stood between them had slowly come down, replaced by trust and a tentative understanding of one another. But with that trust came the fear of what might happen if it was broken. Neither of them had ever allowed themselves to be vulnerable like this before, and now, in the quiet moments they shared together, it felt like they were walking on a fragile line. One evening, Eleanor came home from a meeting, her steps brisk as she entered the penthouse. Mark was sitting on the couch, reading through some papers. He looked up as she walked in, his gaze immediately softening. There was a calmness in her presence now, something that hadn't been there before. She was no longer just the powerful, business-minded woman who had been so focused on her empire. She was more. She was someone who had allowed herself to feel, to open up, even if only a little. "Hey," she said, walking over to him and sitting down. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." Her voice was thoughtful, almost tentative. Mark set the papers aside, his attention entirely on her now. "I know. Me too," he replied, his voice gentle. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I've never felt more sure of anything in my life than I do right now." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, hand in hand, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. But this time, it didn't feel like something they had to rush through. They had both made mistakes. They had both kept parts of themselves hidden. But now, there was only truth. Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, I know this isn't the typical happily ever after. But in a way, I think that's exactly what makes it ours. I never wanted to settle, never thought I would let anyone in. But you've made me see that there's more to life than just control, than just building something perfect. You've made me feel like I can be imperfect. And that's something I never thought I'd find." Mark's heart swelled with emotion at her words. It wasn't love in the traditional sense, but it was something far more complex, far more real. This wasn't just a fairy tale romance. It was two people who had found each other when they least expected it. Two people who had learned to trust, to open up, to be vulnerable. It was a messy, beautiful kind of love. "You've changed my life too," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "I came into this thinking it was just a deal, just a way out of my problems. But now I see that I've found something I never expected, something worth holding on to." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. They didn't need to have everything figured out. They didn't need to be perfect. All they needed was to keep moving forward together. Eleanor smiled softly, her eyes filled with a quiet kind of joy. "Then let's make this our new beginning," she said, her voice steady but full of warmth. "No more pretending. No more contracts. Just us. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Mark smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, trying to fix the pieces that didn't fit. But now, for the first time, he realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know what came next. All he needed was Eleanor. And for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. They sat in silence for a few moments, their hands still intertwined. It wasn't perfect, but in that quiet, simple moment, they both knew that they had found something real. And that was all that mattered. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it didn't matter. Together, they were ready to face it, one step at a time.